The scientist walking through the gates of America's most secret atomic facility that December morning would disappear within weeks, taking with him secrets that would reshape the nuclear balance of power for decades to come. On a cold morning in December 1948, a 35-year-old scientist named George Koval walked through the front entrance of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, flashed his security badge to the guard on duty, and proceeded to his workstation in the technical area of the sprawling atomic research facility. The weather that day was cold and overcast, with temperatures hovering just above freezing. Koval wore a heavy wool coat over his standard work attire, a white button-down shirt, dark slacks, and polished leather shoes. He carried a leather briefcase containing technical documents, a slide rule, and a thermos of coffee his landlady had prepared that morning. George Koval was a health physicist, responsible for monitoring radiation exposure and implementing safety protocols at one of the most sensitive nuclear facilities in the United States. His security clearance granted him access to classified information about the production of enriched uranium and plutonium, the core materials required for atomic weapons. His colleagues knew him as competent and meticulous. His superiors considered him reliable and trustworthy. The security personnel who checked his credentials each morning recognized him by sight and often waved him through with minimal inspection. What none of them knew was that George Koval was a Soviet intelligence agent who had been operating inside the American nuclear weapons program for nearly 4 years, systematically collecting and transmitting some of the most sensitive military secrets in human history. Before we continue with how an Iowa-born scientist became one of the Soviet Union's most valuable atomic spies, if you're interested in the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real cost of intelligence operations, make sure to like this video and subscribe. We bring you meticulously researched cases like this every week. Now, let's go back to 1913, to a small city in Iowa where this story begins. Koval had been born on December 25, 1913, in Sioux City, Iowa, to Russian Jewish immigrants who had fled the pogroms and economic hardship of Tsarist Russia in the early years of the 20th century. His father, Abram Koval, worked as a carpenter and small-time contractor. His mother, Ethel, managed the household and took in sewing work to supplement the family income. George was the second of 3 sons. The family lived in a modest 2-story house in a working-class neighborhood where many of the residents were first- or second-generation immigrants from Eastern Europe. By all accounts, George was an exceptionally bright child with a particular aptitude for mathematics and science. He attended public schools in Sioux City, where teachers noted his quiet demeanor, his voracious reading habits, and his ability to grasp complex concepts with unusual speed. He graduated from Central High School in 1929 at the age of 15, having completed his coursework a year ahead of his peers. The timing of his graduation was unfortunate. Within months of receiving his diploma, the stock market crashed, initiating the Great Depression. The Koval family, like millions of other American families, found themselves struggling financially. Construction work dried up and Abram's income became sporadic and unpredictable. The family depleted their modest savings trying to maintain their household. It was during this period of economic hardship that the Koval family made a decision that would prove to have extraordinary consequences. They decided to emigrate to the Soviet Union. This decision was not as unusual as it might seem in retrospect. During the 1930s, tens of thousands of American citizens, many of them children of immigrants who had fled Russia decades earlier, chose to move to the Soviet Union, lured by Soviet propaganda that promised employment, housing, and a new society free from the economic chaos and inequality of capitalism. The Soviet government actively recruited skilled workers and their families, offering subsidized passage and guaranteed jobs. In 1932, when George was 18 years old, the Koval family departed from New York aboard a Soviet passenger ship bound for Europe. From there, they traveled by train to Moscow. The Soviet government assigned them to Birobidjan, a city in the Soviet Far East, near the Chinese border, that had been designated as the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, a region where Jewish culture would supposedly flourish under Soviet protection. Abram was given work as a construction supervisor. The family was provided with a modest apartment. George enrolled at the Mendeleev Institute of Chemical Technology in Moscow, one of the Soviet Union's premier institutions for training chemists and engineers. Soviet records indicate he was an outstanding student who excelled in chemistry, physics, and mathematics. He completed his degree in chemical engineering in 1939, graduating with honors. What happened during these years in the Soviet Union would remain unclear for decades. Western intelligence agencies would later conclude, based on circumstantial evidence and post-Cold War revelations, that sometime between 1932 and 1939, George Koval was recruited by Soviet military intelligence, specifically the GRU, Glavnoye Razvedivatelnoye Upravlenie, the Foreign Military Intelligence Agency of the Soviet Armed Forces. The GRU's recruitment of Koval made strategic sense. He was a native-born American citizen with perfect English, a strong educational background in technical fields, and no known connections to communist political organizations that might draw the attention of American security services. He could return to the United States and live as an ordinary American, his Soviet connections unknown and unsuspected. In late 1940, George Koval returned to the United States. He told acquaintances that he had grown disillusioned with life in the Soviet Union and wanted to come home. This explanation was accepted without suspicion. Many Americans who had emigrated to the USSR during the Depression had become disillusioned by the harsh realities of Soviet life and had returned to the United States. His return fit a familiar pattern. He settled in New York City, where he worked odd jobs and avoided drawing attention. Those who knew him during this period, according to later FBI interviews, remembered him as quiet and unremarkable, precisely the persona a trained intelligence operative would cultivate. He kept largely to himself, maintained no visible connections to political organizations, and appeared to be simply another young man trying to establish himself in the city. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. Like millions of other young American men, George Koval registered for the draft. In early 1943, at the age of 29, he was inducted into the United States Army. His technical background and education made him a valuable asset to the military. After completing basic training at Camp Upton in New York, he was assigned to the Army Specialized Training Program, ASTP, which identified soldiers with technical skills and provided them with additional education to prepare them for specialized military roles. Koval was sent to the City College of New York, where he studied electrical engineering alongside other ASTP soldiers. In late 1943, the Army reassigned Koval to a classified military program. His orders directed him to report to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the Army Corps of Engineers was overseeing the construction of massive facilities for a project whose nature was not explained to most of the workers and soldiers involved. Koval, along with hundreds of other technically trained personnel, was told only that he would be working on important war-related research. What Koval had been assigned to, though he may not have fully understood this immediately, was the Manhattan Project, the top-secret American effort to develop atomic weapons. Oak Ridge had been selected as one of 3 primary sites for the Manhattan Project, The site encompassed approximately 60,000 acres of land in eastern Tennessee. Beginning in 1942, the U.S. government had forcibly relocated approximately 3,000 residents from the area, demolished their homes and farms, and begun constructing what would eventually become a city of more than 75,000 people: scientists, engineers, construction workers, military personnel, and support staff, all dedicated to producing enriched uranium for atomic bombs. The scale of the operation was staggering. 3 separate plants were constructed at Oak Ridge, each using different methods to separate the fissionable uranium-235 isotope from the more common uranium-238. The K-25 plant used gaseous diffusion. The Y-12 plant used electromagnetic separation. The S-50 plant used liquid thermal diffusion. Together, these facilities consumed enormous amounts of electricity. At their peak, they used more electrical power than the entire city of New York. Security at Oak Ridge was extraordinarily tight. The entire area was surrounded by fences and guard towers. All mail was censored. Telephone calls were monitored. Workers were compartmentalized, with most employees having access only to specific areas and knowing only what was necessary for their particular jobs. The overall purpose of the project was kept secret, even from most of the people working on it. Yet these extensive security measures, despite their scope and intensity, would ultimately fail to prevent one of the most damaging penetrations in the history of American intelligence. George Koval was assigned to the Health Physics Group at Oak Ridge. Health physicists were responsible for monitoring radiation levels, ensuring that workers were not exposed to dangerous doses of radiation, and implementing safety protocols. This role required broad access to different areas of the facility. Health physicists needed to enter production areas to take measurements, review operational procedures to identify radiation hazards, and examine technical documentation to understand the processes that might create exposure risks. In other words, his job gave him legitimate reasons to access information about how enriched uranium was being produced, information that was among the most closely guarded secrets of the Manhattan Project. Intelligence assessments prepared decades later concluded that Koval used his position systematically to collect information about the uranium enrichment processes, the design of the production facilities, the quantities of material being produced, and the technical challenges that workers and scientists were encountering. He had access to technical reports, production figures, and design specifications. He could observe the facilities firsthand and speak with scientists and engineers who understood the details of how the systems worked. His reports to the GRU included detailed specifications of the calutron electromagnetic separation process, polonium-210 production methodologies used in bomb initiators, and data on uranium enrichment rates that revealed production bottlenecks Soviet scientists could avoid. The exact methods Koval used to transmit this information to Soviet intelligence would remain partially unclear even decades later. Based on later intelligence assessments and standard GRU tradecraft of the era, investigators believe he likely used periodic trips away from Oak Ridge during leave periods. As a soldier, Koval was entitled to regular furloughs. During these periods, he traveled to New York City, ostensibly to visit friends or simply to enjoy time away from the isolated and regimented environment of Oak Ridge. In New York, counterintelligence analysts believe Koval likely met with his GRU handlers, Soviet intelligence officers operating under various covers in the city. These meetings would have been brief and conducted with careful attention to tradecraft. Koval would have provided either written reports, photographed documents, or verbal briefings about what he had observed and learned at Oak Ridge. The GRU officers would have provided him with instructions for what information to collect next and would have answered any questions he had about his assignment. This pattern, long periods of access and collection at Oak Ridge, followed by brief trips to New York for information transfer, continued throughout 1944 and into 1945. During this time, Koval was also transferred temporarily to other Manhattan Project sites. In early 1945, he spent several weeks at the Dayton Project in Ohio, a facility that produced polonium-210, a radioactive element used in the initiators of atomic bombs. The initiators were crucial components that triggered the nuclear chain reaction at the precise moment required for a successful detonation. At the Dayton facility, Koval again worked as a health physicist, monitoring radiation safety. This assignment gave him detailed knowledge about polonium production methods, information that Soviet scientists would later acknowledge had been extremely valuable in developing their own atomic weapons program. Koval was not the only Soviet agent who penetrated the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist at Los Alamos, provided detailed bomb design information. Theodore Hall, a young American physicist, also passed secrets to Soviet intelligence. David Greenglass supplied technical drawings, but Koval's unique advantage was his health physics role, which granted him access across multiple facilities and programs without raising the suspicion that a weapons physicist might have attracted. His position was seen as purely technical and safety-oriented, making him nearly invisible to security personnel focused on monitoring scientists working directly on weapons design. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th, ending World War II. The Manhattan Project, which had consumed billions of dollars and employed more than 130,000 people at its peak, had achieved its objective. With the war's end, the urgency of the Manhattan Project diminished, but work on atomic weapons and nuclear technology continued. Many of the scientists and engineers who had worked on the wartime program remained in government service, transitioning to peacetime nuclear research and development. George Koval was among those who stayed. He was honorably discharged from the Army in July 1946, but he continued working at Oak Ridge as a civilian employee, still serving as a health physicist. During the post-war period, Oak Ridge continued to produce enriched uranium and to serve as a center for nuclear research. Koval's access to sensitive information continued. Declassified Soviet documents that were partially released after the Cold War indicate that Koval provided information to the GRU about American nuclear production capabilities, research into more advanced weapons designs, and discussions among American scientists about the strategic implications of atomic weapons. The Soviet Union was racing to develop its own atomic bomb. Joseph Stalin had been informed of the Manhattan Project by Soviet intelligence as early as 1942 and had ordered Soviet scientists to begin their own program. However, the Soviet effort faced enormous technical challenges and resource constraints, particularly given the devastation the USSR had suffered during World War II. Information from agents inside the American program provided Soviet scientists with crucial insights that accelerated their work and helped them avoid dead ends and technical mistakes that the Americans had already solved. Koval continued his work at Oak Ridge until 1948. Then, in late 1948 or early 1949, he made a decision that would protect his identity as a Soviet agent for decades. He left the United States and disappeared. The exact date of his departure from the United States is uncertain. What is known is that sometime in late 1948, he stopped showing up for work at Oak Ridge. When colleagues and supervisors inquired about his absence, They were told he had resigned for personal reasons. His apartment in Oak Ridge was found empty, his belongings gone. Mail sent to his last known addresses was returned as undeliverable. George Koval had vanished. For American counterintelligence agencies, his disappearance did not immediately raise suspicions. Personnel turnover at Oak Ridge was not unusual in the post-war period. Many scientists and technicians who had been recruited during the wartime emergency were leaving government service to return to civilian careers, pursue graduate studies, or take jobs in private industry. His departure was noted but not investigated. No red flags were raised. No security reviews were initiated. He simply left, and no one questioned why. In reality, Koval had fled the United States and returned to the Soviet Union. The GRU, concerned that American counterintelligence was closing in on Soviet agents within the Manhattan Project, had ordered Koval to extract himself before he could be identified and arrested. His extraction was successful. He left no trail that American investigators could follow. In the Soviet Union, Koval was welcomed as a hero of Soviet intelligence. Russian sources indicate he was debriefed extensively by GRU officers and nuclear scientists, providing detailed information about everything he had observed and learned during his 5 years inside the American nuclear program. Soviet scientists later acknowledged that Koval's information about polonium production and uranium enrichment processes had saved them years of research and development time. On August 29, 1949, less than a year after Koval's return to the Soviet Union, the USSR successfully tested its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The test, codenamed First Lightning, shocked American political and military leaders who had believed the Soviet Union was years away from developing a functional atomic weapon. The American monopoly on atomic weapons, which had been a cornerstone of post-war U.S. strategic planning, had lasted only 4 years. The speed with which the Soviet Union had developed the bomb led immediately to suspicions of espionage. American intelligence agencies launched intensive investigations to identify how the Soviets had acquired the knowledge necessary to build atomic weapons so quickly. These investigations would eventually identify several Soviet agents who had worked within the Manhattan Project, including Klaus Fuchs, who was arrested in Britain in 1950, confessed, and served 9 years in prison before being released and moving to East Germany. However, George Koval's role remained unknown to American investigators for more than 50 years. There were several reasons why Koval escaped detection for so long. First, he had left the United States before intensive security reviews of Manhattan Project personnel had been completed. Second, his GRU affiliation meant that he was not part of the Soviet intelligence networks that were eventually compromised by defectors and by the Venona decrypts, intercepted and eventually decrypted Soviet intelligence communications that exposed many Soviet agents in the United States. Third, he had been careful in his tradecraft, avoiding contacts with known communist sympathizers and maintaining the appearance of an ordinary, apolitical American scientist. In the Soviet Union, Koval lived quietly. He was given an apartment in Moscow, a comfortable standard of living by Soviet norms, and employment as a researcher at the Moscow Mendeleev Institute, where he had studied decades earlier. He married a Soviet woman and lived an outwardly conventional life. His work as an intelligence agent was kept secret even from most of his colleagues and neighbors. He became anonymous again, one of thousands of Soviet citizens who had served their country in classified roles during the Cold War. For decades, Koval remained unknown to Western intelligence. His name appeared in no American accounts of Soviet espionage. His role in the Soviet atomic program was unknown outside a small circle of Soviet intelligence officials and scientists. American counterintelligence continued searching for Manhattan Project penetrations, identifying some agents while missing others entirely. Koval was among those who remained invisible. Then, on November 2, 2007, at a ceremony in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin posthumously awarded George Koval the title of Hero of the Russian Federation, Russia's highest honor. The award citation stated that Koval had provided information of tremendous value to the Soviet atomic weapons program and had contributed significantly to achieving strategic parity between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The announcement stunned American intelligence officials and historians. The name George Koval meant nothing to most specialists in Cold War espionage history. Researchers immediately began investigating who he was and what he had done. Through examination of declassified Soviet documents, interviews with retired Russian intelligence officers, and review of American records from the Manhattan Project, investigators pieced together Koval's story. They discovered that he had been born in Iowa, had emigrated to the Soviet Union as a teenager, had been recruited by the GRU, had returned to the United States, and had successfully penetrated the Manhattan Project. American investigators learned of Koval's espionage not through their own counterintelligence work, but through Russian disclosures. After Putin's 2007 announcement, FBI researchers cross-referenced the name against Manhattan Project personnel records and were stunned to find that George Koval had indeed worked at Oak Ridge and Dayton and had never been investigated, never been suspected, and had simply disappeared in 1948 without triggering any security review. American counterintelligence officials were forced to acknowledge that Koval had been one of the most successful Soviet agents of the entire Cold War, and that his success had gone undetected for more than half a century. Intelligence historians subsequently characterized Koval as one of the most damaging Soviet spies who had never been identified by the United States during his lifetime. The belated recognition of Koval's espionage raised numerous questions about how such a penetration could have occurred and how it could have remained undetected for so long. Security procedures at the Manhattan Project had been extensive, but not perfect. Background investigations of personnel had focused primarily on identifying Communist Party membership or associations with known communist organizations. Koval, who had no documented ties to American communist groups, had passed these checks. His emigration to the Soviet Union in 1932 and his subsequent education there should have raised red flags when he applied for work on classified programs. However, the sheer scale of the Manhattan Project, which at its peak employed more than 130,000 people, and the urgency of wartime conditions meant that background investigations were sometimes less thorough than they should have been. Koval's American birth, his American education in New York through the ASTP, and his service in the U.S. Army all contributed to an appearance of loyalty that satisfied investigators. Furthermore, Koval had been assigned to the Manhattan Project not because he had sought security-sensitive work, but because the Army, recognizing his technical qualifications, had assigned him there. From the perspective of military personnel officers, he was simply a drafted soldier with valuable skills being deployed where those skills were most needed. The damage Koval caused to American national security was significant, but difficult to quantify precisely. American intelligence assessments concluded that Koval's information about uranium enrichment processes and polonium production had accelerated the Soviet atomic weapons program by approximately 2 to 3 years. This acceleration had strategic implications affecting the nuclear balance of power during the crucial early years of the Cold War and potentially influencing Soviet confidence during crises such as the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949. The psychological and political impact was also considerable. The revelation that the Soviet Union had successfully placed an agent in such a sensitive position within the Manhattan Project contributed to the climate of suspicion and paranoia that characterized the early Cold War period in the United States. It validated concerns about Soviet espionage and contributed to support for aggressive counterintelligence measures, including security clearance procedures that would affect hundreds of thousands of Americans over subsequent decades. George Koval died in Moscow on January 31, 2006, at the age of 92. Russian sources indicate he had lived his final years in relative comfort, supported by a state pension, and occasionally consulted by historians and intelligence officials documenting the history of Soviet espionage operations. He reportedly remained committed to the belief that his espionage had been justified, that providing the Soviet Union with atomic weapons technology had created the balance of power necessary to prevent nuclear war. After Putin's 2007 announcement of Koval's award, American and Russian researchers attempted to interview people who had known him during his years in the United States. The effort produced limited results. Most of his contemporaries from Oak Ridge and the City College of New York were deceased. Those who were still alive had only dim memories of an unremarkable colleague who had kept to himself and had left no strong impression. One former colleague from Oak Ridge, interviewed in 2008 at the age of 87, described Koval with vague recollections as someone professional and reserved. The colleague said that Koval had been good at his job, had followed safety protocols carefully, and had been generally well regarded by supervisors. When told that Koval had been a Soviet spy, the colleague expressed disbelief, then shock, then a kind of resigned acknowledgement. "I suppose we were all naive," the colleague said. "We never imagined that someone like George could be working for the Russians. He seemed so American." This observation captured one of the most unsettling aspects of Koval's case. He had seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, so trustworthy. There had been no warning signs, no suspicious behaviors, no red flags that might have alerted his colleagues or security officials to his true allegiances. He had lived a double life with apparent ease, maintaining the appearance of a loyal American soldier and scientist while systematically betraying the country of his birth. The question of how to understand Koval's motivations and choices is complicated by the fact that he left no memoir, no confession, no detailed explanation of his thinking. Russian sources that quoted him in his later years suggested that he believed he had acted morally, that he had helped prevent American nuclear monopoly, and had thereby contributed to global peace and stability. This rationalization was common among Soviet agents who provided atomic secrets to the USSR. Klaus Fuchs made similar arguments, as did other scientists who believed that nuclear weapons were too dangerous to be monopolized by any single nation. But this rationalization elided crucial moral and practical questions. The Soviet Union under Stalin was a brutal totalitarian state responsible for the deaths of millions of its own citizens through political purges, forced collectivization, and the Gulag system. Providing such a regime with atomic weapons, technology cannot be straightforwardly characterized as a contribution to peace or justice, regardless of arguments about strategic balance. Koval made his choices within a specific historical context, growing up during the Depression, witnessing the rise of fascism, experiencing the Soviet Union during the 1930s, and living through World War II. These experiences shaped his worldview and his understanding of political and moral questions. The fact that he chose to work for Soviet intelligence rather than defecting or becoming a double agent suggests that his commitment to the Soviet system survived whatever disillusionment he might have experienced during his years in the USSR. His choices had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. The atomic secrets that Koval and other Soviet agents provided to the USSR contributed to the nuclear arms race that would dominate international relations for 4 decades, and that would create the ever-present possibility of nuclear annihilation that hung over the world during the Cold War. Millions of people lived in fear of nuclear war because nations possessed weapons that could destroy civilization. The proliferation of these weapons to additional countries, enabled in part by Soviet espionage successes, further increased these dangers. At the same time, some historians and strategic analysts have argued that nuclear parity between the United States and the Soviet Union may have actually reduced the risk of direct military conflict between the superpowers. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, in which both sides possessed sufficient nuclear weapons to destroy each other, created powerful disincentives for conventional warfare that might escalate to nuclear exchange. Whether Koval's espionage contributed to stability or instability depends on contested judgments about nuclear deterrence theory and Cold War history. What is not contested is that Koval successfully deceived the United States government, evaded detection for more than 50 years, and died believing he had acted correctly. He experienced no legal consequences for his espionage, no punishment for his betrayal, no accountability for the secrets he had stolen. From his perspective, he had served his country, the Soviet Union, which he apparently considered his true homeland despite his American birth, and had been appropriately honored for that service. The absence of consequences for Koval stands in sharp contrast to the fates of other Soviet agents within the Manhattan Project who were caught. Klaus Fuchs was arrested in Britain in 1950, confessed, and served 9 years in prison before being released and moving to East Germany. David Greenglass, who provided information from Los Alamos, was arrested in 1950, pleaded guilty, and served 10 years in prison. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who served as couriers for atomic secrets, were arrested in 1950, convicted, and executed in 1953, despite continuing controversy about the extent of Ethel's actual involvement and the proportionality of their sentences. Koval avoided this fate through a combination of timing, tradecraft, and organizational separation. His GRU affiliation kept him outside the compromised networks. His decision to leave the country before intensive security reviews were completed removed him from danger before he could be identified. His careful maintenance of an apolitical persona meant that even when investigators later reviewed Manhattan Project personnel, he did not stand out as suspicious. The question of George Koval's identity resists simple categorization. Born in Iowa, educated initially in American schools, he was American by birth and circumstance. Yet he spent 8 formative years in the Soviet Union, absorbed Soviet ideology, accepted GRU recruitment, and ultimately chose to spend his final 57 years in Russia. He was neither purely American nor purely Soviet. He was something more complicated, a child of Russian immigrants who grew up American but reconnected with Russian culture and communist ideology at precisely the moment when that ideology was recruiting agents to penetrate American secrets. His life embodied the transnational complexity that made Cold War espionage so difficult to combat. He could pass as American because he was American. He could serve Soviet intelligence because he believed in the Soviet cause. The categories of loyalty and betrayal that seemed clear-cut to security officials were, in Koval's lived experience, far more ambiguous. The consequences of his choice extended beyond the strategic and political realms into the personal and human. Koval apparently never married during his years in the United States and had no children from that period. His closest relationships were presumably with his GRU handlers and with whatever network of contacts he maintained in New York. He lived a compartmentalized existence, unable to form deep friendships or romantic attachments because maintaining his cover required distance and deception. The psychological cost of this isolation is difficult to measure but undoubtedly significant. Even in the Soviet Union, where he married and presumably built a more normal personal life, Soviet intelligence officers were typically instructed to maintain secrecy about their work, even from family members. Koval may have lived the remainder of his life without ever being able to speak openly about what he had done, what he had accomplished, or what inner conflicts he may have experienced. For George Koval, espionage was a career that spanned only about 5 years of active operation, from late 1943 when he arrived at Oak Ridge until late 1948 when he fled to the Soviet Union. But those 5 years had consequences that reverberated for decades. The information he provided helped the Soviet Union develop atomic weapons years earlier than it would have otherwise. Those weapons shaped the course of the Cold War, influenced the behavior of nations, and created dangers that persist into the 21st century. His story also illustrates the human dimension of intelligence operations. He was not a master spy in the cinematic sense. No elaborate disguises, no dramatic escapes, no violent confrontations. He was a methodical scientist who collected information, passed it to his handlers, and performed his espionage in the spaces between his ordinary responsibilities as a health physicist and U.S. Army soldier. His success came not from spectacular tradecraft, but from patient, careful work over an extended period. The people Koval worked alongside at Oak Ridge and Dayton had no idea they were helping a Soviet agent collect classified information. They answered his questions, explained technical processes, shared documents, and provided access to facilities because he was their colleague, because helping him was part of their job, because he seemed trustworthy. None of them bore any responsibility for his espionage, but all of them became unwitting facilitators of it simply by doing their jobs normally. This aspect of espionage, the way it exploits ordinary cooperation and trust, makes it particularly corrosive to organizations and institutions. Effective security requires suspicion, compartmentalization, and restrictions on information sharing. But effective research and development require collaboration, openness, and free exchange of ideas. Reconciling these competing requirements remains extremely difficult, and the Manhattan Project's security procedures, despite their scope and intensity, ultimately failed to prevent significant penetrations. The story of George Koval raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of loyalty, identity, and betrayal in a world where people cross borders, hold multiple allegiances, and navigate between competing systems and ideologies. It reveals the limitations of background investigations that focus on visible political affiliations while missing deeper ideological commitments. It demonstrates how the urgency of wartime conditions can create vulnerabilities that adversaries exploit, and it shows how successful espionage operations can remain invisible for decades, their damage assessed only when it is far too late to prevent. George Koval was born in Iowa on Christmas Day, 1913. He died in Moscow in January 2006. Having lived 57 years in the Soviet Union, he served, and only 33 in the America he betrayed. 9 months after his death, Vladimir Putin would reveal to the world what American counterintelligence had never discovered: that one of the most damaging penetrations of the Manhattan Project had walked away undetected, unpunished, and unrepentant, a ghost in the machine of history's most consequential secret.